The air in our living room felt cold and heavy, like a storm was about to break. I stood by the window, my hands clenched into tight fists as I watched a silver car pull into our gravel driveway. My heart hammered against my ribs because I knew exactly who was inside. Out stepped my Aunt Beatrice, looking as sharp and clinical as a winter frost. She wasn't alone. A man in a uniform followed her, his face a mask of professional indifference. My mother, Clara, was standing near the hallway, her fingers nervously pleating the fabric of her faded apron. She looked so small and fragile in that moment, her eyes wide with a fear that broke my heart. We had been through so much since my father passed away, and this house was the only sanctuary we had left. It was the place where every memory of him lived, from the height marks on the doorframe to the smell of old books in his study. Beatrice didn't even knock. She simply pushed the door open and marched in, holding a crisp white envelope as if it were a weapon of war. She looked around the room with a sneer of disgust, as if our home was nothing more than a pile of junk. "This property is no longer yours, Clara," Beatrice said, her voice dropping like a heavy stone into a quiet pond. She didn't look at me. She kept her icy gaze fixed entirely on my mother, who seemed to shrink under the weight of those words. The deputy stood behind her, silent but watching everything with a practiced, neutral eye. He didn't look like he wanted to be there, but his presence made the threat feel terrifyingly real. My mother froze, her breath hitching in her throat, and I could see her hands trembling violently. "Beatrice, please," she whispered, her voice cracking with a desperation that made my chest tighten until it hurt. We had lived here for 20 years, and the thought of being tossed out onto the street was more than I could bear. This house was everything we had left after the funeral and the medical bills. It was our fortress, our history, and our safety net. But Beatrice didn't care about history or family ties. She only cared about the value of the dirt beneath our feet and the power she thought she held over us. She looked at the deputy and then back at my mother, a cruel smile touching the corners of her thin, pale lips. "You've overstayed your welcome, and honestly, you've let the place go to ruin," Beatrice continued, her tone dripping with fake concern. She waved the eviction notice in the air, the paper rustling like dry leaves in a graveyard. "Pack your things. I want you out by sunset. I have plans for this land that don't include housing relatives who can't pay their way." My mother's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out to touch the wall for support. It felt like the world was shifting beneath us, turning into something unrecognizable and cruel. I wanted to scream, to run at my aunt and rip that paper to shreds, but I felt paralyzed by the sheer unfairness of it all. Just as the tension reached a breaking point and my mother looked like she might collapse, the front door opened again. A man in a perfectly tailored navy suit walked in, his footsteps firm and confident on the hardwood floor. He carried a thick, sealed legal folder under his arm, and his presence immediately changed the energy in the room. He didn't look like a deputy or a debt collector. He looked like the hand of fate itself, stepping into our living room to stop the clock. The man looked directly at Beatrice, ignoring her shocked expression, and spoke in a voice that was as calm as a deep river. "You're attempting to remove the legal owners of this property," he said, and the words echoed through the house like a bell. The deputy stiffened immediately, his hand moving away from his belt as he sensed the legal shift in the air. Beatrice turned sharply, her face reddening with a mix of anger and sudden confusion. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shrill and defensive. "And how did you get into this house? This is a private legal matter." The man didn't flinch. He walked to the center of the room and opened the folder, pulling out several pages that looked heavy with official seals. "My name is Julian Cole," he replied, adjusting his glasses. "I am a property and trust law attorney representing the interests of the Carter family. And I am here to inform you that this land is not, and has never been, under your control." I looked at my mother, who was staring at Julian as if he were an angel dropped from the sky. She looked confused, but for the first time in months, a tiny spark of hope appeared in her tired eyes. Julian placed the thick papers on our coffee table, spreading them out with a slow, deliberate motion that commanded everyone's attention. "This is the original deed," he said, pointing to a document with an ornate gold seal. And this is the trust registration, along with the ownership transfer records that were filed several years ago. My mother gripped my arms so tightly it left marks, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I could feel her heart racing against my shoulder as we leaned in to look at the documents. Beatrice scoffed, trying to regain her lost confidence, though her eyes were darting nervously between the attorney and the papers. "I've been managing this property for years," she yelled, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I paid the taxes when my brother was too sick to care. I kept the records. That gives me the right to decide what happens here." Julian looked up from the table, his expression unreadable but firm. "Managing a property, Beatrice, does not equal owning it," he replied. "A caretaker is not a king, and a manager is not a landlord. The law is very specific about where the true power lies in this situation." The silence that followed was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. The deputy looked like he wanted to disappear into the wallpaper, realizing he might have been part of an illegal action. Julian turned the top page of the folder toward the room, making sure the light hit the bold, black ink at the top of the document. "The registered owner of this property, including the house and all surrounding acreage, is the Lily Carter Family Trust," he announced. My name. I felt a jolt of electricity run through my body, making my hair stand on end. I stared at the paper, seeing my own name printed in formal letters next to words like sole trustee and primary beneficiary. The room went completely still, as if everyone had stopped breathing at once. Even I didn't know it was this clear. I knew my father had worked hard, but I never imagined he had built a fortress of paper and law to keep us safe. My mother looked at me in total shock, her mouth falling open as she realized that her daughter, not her sister-in-law, held the keys to our future. It was a revelation that changed everything in a single heartbeat. Beatrice let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh that sounded more like a bark. "This is ridiculous," she cried, gesturing wildly toward me. "She's just a girl. She's barely out of school. How could she possibly own a multi-million-dollar estate? My brother would never have been so foolish as to leave everything to a child." Julian didn't react to her outburst. He simply stood there with his hands folded in front of him, the picture of professional patience. "She is the sole legal trustee and beneficiary," he repeated, his voice cutting through Beatrice's noise. "The trust was established to ensure that the property remained in the direct line of succession. Your name, Beatrice, appears nowhere on these documents except as a former temporary administrator, a role that was revoked upon the death of the grantor." My mother looked at me, her eyes wet with tears of relief. The weight that had been crushing her for months seemed to lift, leaving her looking younger and stronger than she had since the funeral. We weren't just staying in our house. We were the masters of it. The realization was so powerful it made me feel dizzy, like I was seeing the world in color for the very first time. As the reality of the situation began to sink in, I suddenly remembered my father's words from years ago. We had been sitting on the porch, watching the fireflies dance in the tall grass of the meadow. He patted my hand and whispered, "Some things are safer when you don't see them until you need them, Lily. Just remember that you are stronger than you look, and I will always be looking out for you." At the time, I thought he was just being poetic or talking about the stars. But standing in our living room, watching an attorney dismantle my aunt's cruel plans, I understood exactly what he meant. He knew Beatrice's character long before I did. He knew her greed and her desire for control, and he had spent years quietly building a wall of protection around us that she could never climb. He had given me a gift that wasn't just about money or land. It was the gift of security and the power to stand up for my mother. The deputy lowered the eviction papers he had been holding, his posture shifting from enforcer to observer. "This is out of my jurisdiction," he said quietly, looking at Beatrice with a frown. Beatrice realized she was losing control fast, and the panic began to show in the way her eyes darted around the room. She quickly changed her tone, smoothing her hair and trying to force a smile that didn't reach her cold eyes. "Now, let's not get ahead of ourselves," she said, her voice shaking slightly despite her best efforts. "I was only trying to handle family responsibilities. I thought Clara was overwhelmed, and I wanted to make sure the estate was being handled properly. It was all out of love for my brother's memory. But her acting was terrible, and the lie hung in the air like smoke. Julian didn't buy it for a second. He turned another page in the folder, revealing a section highlighted in yellow. The property was legally transferred into the trust years before your brother passed away, he explained. It is an irrevocable trust. That means it cannot be changed, challenged, or undone by outside parties. It is fully protected from any claims of debt or inheritance from other family members. Every word he spoke was like a nail in the coffin of Beatrice's plan. She had come here to destroy our lives, but she had only succeeded in exposing her own greed. My mother whispered, her voice barely audible. So we were never at risk? All those nights I spent crying, thinking we'd be homeless. We were safe. I shook my head slowly, reaching out to take her hand. No, Mom. We were protected all along. Dad made sure of it. The relief in her eyes was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The fear that had lived in our house like a ghost was finally being exorcised. Julian continued his explanation, detailing how the trust covered not only the land but also the upkeep and a small stipend for my mother's care. It was a complete plan, a masterclass in foresight. Beatrice tried calling someone on her phone, her fingers fumbling with the screen, but there was no answer that could help her. She looked exposed, stripped of her fake authority and her legal threats. She was just a woman standing in someone else's house, trying to steal something that didn't belong to her. The deputy made a move toward the door, clearly wanting to be far away from this family disaster. I'll be taking my leave, he said. The eviction is clearly invalid based on these documents. All eviction actions are invalid, Julian stated firmly, his voice echoing in the now quiet room. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Beatrice was no longer the one in charge. She was an intruder. I felt a surge of confidence I had never known before. I looked at my aunt, the woman who had tried to break my mother's spirit, and I didn't feel anger. I felt pity. She had spent so much energy trying to take what wasn't hers that she had forgotten what it meant to be family. You should go now, Beatrice, I said, my voice steady and clear. She looked at me, her face contorting with rage, but she couldn't say anything. The legal documents on the table were an unmovable wall. Outside, I could see the neighbors beginning to watch from their porches. They had seen the deputy's car and Beatrice's aggressive arrival, and whispers were already spreading quickly through our small town. Is she really trying to evict them illegally? Someone called out from the sidewalk. The community we had lived in for decades was witnessing her true nature, and the public shame was clearly starting to sting. Beatrice heard it all, and her face turned a deep, embarrassed shade of purple. Julian wasn't finished yet. He reached into the folder and pulled out a small digital recorder. There is one more thing the trust creator wanted you to hear, he said, looking at Beatrice. He pressed a button, and my father's voice filled the room, warm and vibrant, just like I remembered. This home belongs to Lily, the recording played. It is her sanctuary and her mother's home. No one else decides the fate of this land. If anyone tries to take it, know that I have seen you coming, and I have made sure you will fail. The silence that followed the recording was absolute. My mother started to sob, but they were tears of joy and closure. Margaret went completely silent, her shoulders sagging as the weight of my father's final warning hit her. This can't be real, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. But it was. It was the most real thing in the room. She just never had access to the truth because she was never meant to have it. My father had known her heart, and he had locked the door against her long ago. She was a stranger in a house she thought she could own. Julian added a final, chilling note to the conversation. Wrongful eviction attempts can lead to serious legal consequences, Beatrice. Attempting to use a deputy to enforce a fraudulent claim is a matter the local prosecutor might find very interesting. Margaret took a step back, her confidence completely gone. She looked small now, like a wilted plant in a garden she couldn't tend. Her threats had turned into liabilities. My mother sat down slowly in her favorite armchair, the one my father had bought her for their 10th anniversary. She looked around the room, really seeing it for the first time in months. She had thought we were powerless, victims of a cruel system and a greedy relative. But we were never unprotected. We were the owners of our destiny, and the house felt like it was breathing with us again. The deputy left without another word, his boots thudding on the porch steps as he headed back to his car. The eviction was over before it had even truly begun, ending not with a move-out truck, but with a legal folder and a father's love. Beatrice tried one last, desperate attempt to save face. "You can't erase my place in this family," she screamed, her voice cracking with the effort of holding onto her pride. "I am a Blake. This land was supposed to stay in the family name." Julian responded firmly, not even looking up from his papers. "You are never listed as an owner, Beatrice. The family name is Carter, and the trust ensures it stays that way. Your place in this family is defined by your actions, not by a deed you don't possess." The truth landed hard, a final blow to her ego. She looked at me, hoping for some kind of mercy, but I just stood my ground. I wasn't going to let her manipulate me the way she had manipulated my mother. Julian then showed her the official land registry on his tablet, a digital map of the property where only one controlling name existed: mine. It was a modern confirmation of an old promise. The digital lines and official stamps were the final proof that her reign of terror was over. She was a ghost in the machinery, a glitch that had been corrected by a well-designed system. The social shift was almost immediate. Neighbors who had been hesitant to visit because of the drama now started walking toward our gate. They had seen the deputy leave and heard Beatrice's screams, and they were coming to offer support. Beatrice's influence, which she had carefully built through lies and intimidation, began to collapse publicly. People who once feared her were now whispering about her illegal behavior. I could see the realization on her face. She hadn't just lost the land. She had lost her reputation. I stood there, watching her realize that she had no allies left. I could have escalated things legally right then and there. I could have sued her for harassment or pushed for charges regarding the fraudulent eviction. But I didn't. Not yet. I wanted her to feel the weight of her failure first. I wanted her to walk out of our house knowing that she had been defeated by the very brother she thought she could outsmart. For the first time, she lost her composure entirely, her eyes welling with angry, bitter tears. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she sobbed, but it was too late for excuses. Belief doesn't change legality, and Beatrice's beliefs were rooted in greed, not justice. The eviction was officially withdrawn, and Julian handed my mother a document confirming that no further actions could be taken against us. My mother stood up and began walking through the house slowly, her hand trailing along the walls and furniture. She was reclaiming her life, room by room, memory by memory. The kitchen, where we had baked cookies, the hallway, where I had learned to walk, the living room, where we had said goodbye to my father. It was all ours again, truly and legally. Beatrice finally turned and walked out the door, her head down, her silver car speeding away down the driveway. The dust she kicked up settled quickly, leaving the air clear and still. Weeks later, everything was finalized. The legal clouds had parted, and the sun was shining on our little piece of a world. At a small family gathering we held to celebrate, someone asked who actually owned the house now. My mother looked at me, a proud smile on her face, and said softly, "Lily does." The house felt different after that day. The shadows that had seemed so dark and threatening were now just parts of a beautiful, old building. I spent my days learning about the trust and how to manage the land responsibly. I wanted to honor my father's hard work by being a good steward of what he had left us. My mother blossomed, her health improving as the stress of the eviction faded into a distant memory. She started gardening again, planting bright yellow marigolds along the front walkway where Beatrice had stood with her cruel papers. We were no longer living in fear of the mail or the telephone. Every time I walked through the front door, I felt a sense of peace that was deeper than anything I had ever known. I realized that my father's greatest gift wasn't the land or the money. It was the knowledge that we were loved enough to be protected from beyond the grave. He had known the world could be a harsh place, and he had built us a shelter that no storm could knock down. I was the owner of the land, but more importantly, I was the guardian of our family's peace. As I sat on the porch one evening, looking out over the meadow, I thought about the lessons I had learned. I learned that power isn't about how loud you can yell or how many papers you can wave in someone's face. True power is quiet, planned, and rooted in love. Beatrice had all the noise, but I had the truth. I also learned that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes, the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you need protection from. But I was lucky. I had a father who saw the future and a mother who never gave up, even when she was scared. I looked at the golden light hitting the grass and felt a deep sense of gratitude. The journey hadn't been easy, and the confrontation with Beatrice was one of the hardest things I'd ever faced, but it had led us to this moment of absolute clarity. The Lily Carter Family Trust wasn't just a legal entity, it was a promise kept. And as long as I was standing, that promise would never be broken. We were home, and this time we were staying for good. The whispers in town eventually turned into a different kind of story, a story of a daughter who stood up for her mother and a father who outsmarted a greedy sister. Beatrice moved away a few months later, unable to handle the cold shoulders she received at the grocery store and the church. She had tried to take our house, but she ended up losing her own place in the community. I didn't feel any joy in her departure, just a sense of closure. The legal lock Julian had placed on the property was unbreakable, and I made sure to keep his number on speed dial, just in case. My mother and I grew closer than ever, sharing our memories of my father without the bitterness of the eviction hanging over us. We talked about his laugh, his wisdom, and the way he always knew how to fix things. He had fixed our future, even after he was gone. The house was more than just wood and stone. It was a testament to a man's love for his family. And every time I looked at the deed, I saw his signature not just as a legal requirement, but as a final "I love you." I often think back to that day in the living room, the way the light caught the dust motes in the air as Julian opened his folder. It was the moment my childhood officially ended and my life as a woman began. I had to grow up fast to handle the responsibility of the trust, but I did it with pride. I learned about taxes, land management, and the intricate details of property law. I wanted to be as prepared as my father had been. My mother watched me with admiration, often saying I reminded her of him more every day. It was the greatest compliment she could give me. We were a team, two women who had survived a storm and came out stronger on the other side. There was no drama anymore, no revenge, and no more tears. Just the truth standing where it always belonged, as solid as the foundation of our home. I would look at the sunset from the porch and know that the land beneath my feet was mine, protected, and filled with the spirits of those who truly loved us. One afternoon, I found an old letter from my father tucked inside one of his law books. It wasn't a legal document, just a simple note written on yellowed paper. "Lily," it read, "if you are reading this, it means you've had to use the protections I set up. I'm sorry the world was unkind enough to make that necessary, but I am so proud of you for standing tall. Use this land to build a life of kindness, not greed. Your mother is your heart. Take care of her." I cried as I read those words, feeling his presence in the room as strongly as if he were standing there. He hadn't just given me trust. He had given me a mission. I shared the letter with my mother, and we sat together on the sofa, holding each other and the letter. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the emotional anchor for all the legal maneuvers. We realized then that while Beatrice had been looking for a payday, my father had been looking for a legacy. And his legacy was sitting right there in that living room, safe and sound. The community began to see us as a symbol of resilience. People would stop by with pies or flowers, apologizing for not speaking up sooner when Beatrice was being difficult. I realized that people often want to help, but they don't always know how until the truth comes out. I made it a point to be active in the town, using some of the resources from the trust to help local charities and the school. I wanted the name Lily Carter to be associated with generosity, a sharp contrast to the way Beatrice had behaved. My mother joined me in these efforts, finding a new purpose in her life. We were no longer the poor widows of the town. We were the Carters, a family with deep roots and a strong future. The land flourished under our care, the gardens growing lush and the house gleaming with fresh paint. It was a physical manifestation of our internal healing. Every board we fixed and every flower we planted was a victory over the darkness that had tried to consume us. There were times, of course, when the memory of that day would still make my heart race. I would see a silver car or a man in a navy suit, and for a split second, the panic would return. But then I would remember the thick papers on the coffee table and the sound of my father's voice on the recorder. I would touch the key in my pocket and feel the cold metal, a reminder that I was the one who held the power. The fear was a ghost, but the trust was real. I learned to breathe through those moments, letting the peace of the house wash over me. I was no longer a victim. I was a protector. I had seen the worst of people in Beatrice, but I had also seen the best of people in Julian and my father. The balance of the world felt right again. I was living a life that was finally, truly mine, and I intended to make every single second of it count for something good. Years passed, and the story of the great eviction that wasn't became a local legend. Younger generations would hear about it and learn that you should never underestimate a quiet girl with a legal trust. I eventually finished my studies and took over the full management of the estate, expanding our small farm and turning part of the land into a community park. My mother lived a long, happy life in the house she loved, surrounded by the memories of her husband and the successes of her daughter. When she finally passed away, she did so in her own bed, in the house she had almost lost. I was by her side, holding her hand, and her last words to me were, "Thank you for keeping us home, Lily." It was the culmination of everything we had fought for. I stood in the quiet house afterward, feeling the weight of the legacy, but it didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like a warm blanket, a familiar and comforting presence that would always be there. Today, I stand in that same living room where Beatrice once waved her cruel paper. The house is full of life now. My own children are playing in the hallway, their laughter echoing off the walls just like mine once did. They know the story of their grandfather and the trust he built for them. They know that this land is a sacred trust, something to be protected and cherished. My Aunt Beatrice is long gone, a footnote in a history she tried to rewrite. I look out the window at the gravel driveway and smile. There are no silver cars today, just the sun shining on the marigolds and the peaceful sound of the wind in the trees. The truth is a powerful thing, and when it stands where it belongs, everything else falls into place. No drama, no revenge, just a family, a home, and the quiet truth that we were always meant to be here. I am Lily Carter, and this is my home, exactly as it was always meant to be.